Bennett had an idea that I should take the mule and backtrack to where we had seen the animal's track in the snow earlier. The hope was that we might be able to catch some game, an elk or bear, something substantial to give us good meat. I didn't need much convincing, so I saddled the mule and made tracks back to where we had seen the trail. I followed the path as best I could, though it was sluggish and unhelpful in giving me any clue as to what sort of animal had made it. Eventually, I tracked it out of the snow and into a thicket of chaparral. It wasn't easy going. Some of those shrubs stood as high as the mule's back, but I kept on, pushing through the dense underbrush. It was only when I emerged from the chaparral that I got a proper look at the track, and saw that it had been made by either an ox or a cow, and maybe even an elk. It was hard to tell exactly since it was so faint. The chaparral stretched on, covering acres of flat scrubland. I went through it for a mile or two, persevering until I reached the apex of a steep hill that looked down over a deep canyon and a creek, lined with sycamore, alder, and weeping willow trees. There, across the creek, was a small natural meadow stretching out for half an acre or so, with little clumps of sycamore trees dotting the landscape. I slowed to a stop, straining my ears and eyes for any sign of movement down there. After a few minutes, my eyes locked onto some sort of horned animal grazing in the meadow. I reckoned it was good enough game for me to catch, so I led the mule down the hill towards the creek, tied her up, and then crept along the bank, hunkered down about 4 feet high towards the little meadow. Once I was close enough, I hoisted myself up behind a group of sycamores, getting within 50 yards of an animal that I could only see dimly. I took a shot, square in the forehead, and the animal came down without a struggle. I quickly loaded again and then saw 2 smaller cattle rushing around as if terrified, but not really aware of what was happening or where the danger was coming from. I gave a low whistle, and one of them looked towards me just long enough for me to take a shot and bring it down as well. The third one was hiding behind a thicket of sycamores, so I looked for an opening, a crack in the foliage, anything to give me a clear view of my target. Finally, I saw its face peeping through a slot no more than 3 inches wide, and I took a shot, wounding it. I rushed up, then finished it off with one final blow. I peered closely at my catch and determined that the first one in my sights was a pitiable old cow, but the rest were youthful yearlings, one of them plump and savory. Within no time, I had sliced off their hindquarters and collected all the extra fat I could spare. It was enough to make even the mule groan under its weight. As the light began to fade, my brain switched to the next issue at hand: how to get back to the campsite. The dense foliage and shrubbery on the hillsides would make it a grueling task, especially with a hefty load of meat. After some careful consideration, I discerned that tracing alongside the creek would be the most viable means of getting to my goal, rather than loosely exploring the path that had led me here. The overhanging vegetation was so thick that I had no choice but to wade into the muddied stream, occasionally stumbling upon submerged pits and pools that instantly soaked me through like a rag. A few bruises later, as I arrived at a tiny open space, the damp darkness convinced me to stay and halt my progress for the night. Not to mention the ominous clouds that gathered above and a few drops of rain that pattered on my skin like a drum made the choice quite clear. I found a supple patch of grass for the mule to graze on, but my own situation was bleak, as the prospect of an unpleasant night amid the rain loomed over me. Nevertheless, as wood was abundant around, I opted to light a fire and take my chances. I looked for matches and struck one. Nothing happened. They were damp, and try as I might, I could not produce even the tiniest flicker or spark. It seemed that darkness would rule the night. A camping trip without fire in this dank and sodden setting was not an option. Hence, I concluded there was no use waiting in the cold, and instead elected to gradually follow the water's path downstream through dense thicket and icy water. So the little mule and I set off, splashing through the creek in the thick darkness. The only light we had came from the sky peeking through gaps in the trees. Little did I know that a grizzly bear could easily snatch me, the mule, and our meat for its supper. Luckily, the grizzly stayed put, and we trudged on through prickly brambles and tough brush that made it nearly impossible to push through. As it turned out, I was in luck and managed to avoid the brunt of the storm. Soon the canyon opened up, and I spotted a piece of tableland covered in brush to the right. It looked like it would be easier to get through than staying in the creek bed. The slope up to the tableland was steep, but only about 50 yards high. The mule was making steady progress until she slipped on the wet earth near the top and slid all the way down to the bottom. I helped her up and we tried again, with me holding her steady as she rested. Eventually we made it to the top. The mule led us along what seemed like a trail, but I couldn't see much in the thick darkness. The brush was 3 feet high and densely packed, but we pushed on. After a while, the mule refused to go any further. I could sense that something was blocking her path, so I carefully made my way past her and pushed through the brush. As I moved deeper into the thicket, I could hear rustling and see faint shapes ahead of me. In a moment, I realized that it was just our loyal dog Cuff, not some terrifying specter. The amiable chap had caught wind of our arrival and greeted us warmly. Even my trusty mule was pleased to see him. He snuffled at the animal's load before moving ahead onto the trail, which we followed. It was the wee hours of the morning when we finally made it to the campsite. There was a lively fire crackling away, but all were fast asleep. When I finally led my mule towards the fire, rousing them with a holler of "Wake up!" everyone sprang to their feet, barely bothering to dress since they had been resting without changing out of their clothes. John took charge of the mule and instructed me to slip into his cozy bed. After removing my damp clothes, I asked him to dry them and then settled beneath the warm, dry blankets in complete comfort. The sun rose rapidly, it seemed, and before I could rise from my slumber it had been up for hours. As I drifted off to sleep, I overheard the women whispering as they sliced meat to roast. "Look at that fat! Just look at how perfect it is!" They quickly roasted the delectable morsels over the fire, consuming them eagerly and giving great praise to the sweet fat. "We love the fat," they chimed, pleased that their bodies craved the nourishment that the lean beef couldn't provide. No one went back to sleep once I arrived, with everyone remaining awake, roasting and eating their fill until they were gratified. This outdoor excursion was unlike any deer hunting I had experienced in Wisconsin, or any pursuit of game in Death Valley where hardly anything lived. It was easily the most arduous night's work of my life and not the exciting adventure I usually sought out while hunting. Despite feeling quite drained upon waking, I wholeheartedly enjoyed a delicacy made from the prize I had won the night before, relishing the succulent meat. They all requested I share my most recent hunting escapades and lavished me with praise as a fortunate fellow. We were finally free from the burden of killing any more of our oxen just to survive. We had already slaughtered 6, and only 5 remained. Our situation now was a stark contrast to just a few days prior, when we dragged ourselves across the arid desert, hungry, aching, and parched. At that time, lying down felt easier than moving forward. But now we were elated to be saved from such a dire situation. We reveled in our freedom from grief. The hills and mountains around us appeared more enchanting than ever before. They were adorned with lush greenery instead of the barren wasteland we had been trudging through. The creek sang melodiously, the most cheerful and spirited stream I had ever heard. Wild birds approached us without fear, appearing amiable and welcoming. All was tranquil and cozy. The sun shone just the right amount, not too hot nor too cold. When it was time to continue our journey, I discovered I had misplaced my saddle blanket in the midst of our adventure, so they swapped it with another one. I retraced my steps to the area where the mule had slipped down the bank and located it. I caught up to them just as they were settling down for the night. Mrs. Bennet had taken ill suddenly, stricken with severe pain and vomiting, similar to what Rogers and I had experienced after eating our initial meal of California corn. Her feeble stomach could not handle the rich, fatty meat. All the while, Arcane suspected Rogers and I were plotting to astonish them by misleading them into thinking the house we visited was quite distant and then catching them off guard with its unexpected appearance. We assured them it would take a couple of camps to get there, and even longer if Mrs. Bennet did not recover promptly. Our campsite was beneath a massive live oak tree, surrounded by a thick layer of dry leaves. We grazed our cattle and mule in a nearby lovely meadow where they munched, drank, and rested. The oxen chewed their food contentedly, looking as satisfied as anyone could be. They lounged about, napping and eating simultaneously, displaying an air of complete repose. We rested by the brook, taking the opportunity to wash our clothes and cleanse ourselves after enduring the unforgiving heat and dirt of our journey. Our faces and hands, stained by the harsh elements, required multiple washes before they appeared clean once again. With our feet dangling in the cool water, we found relief from the exhausting trek. In our oblivion, we failed to recognize the lurking presence of grizzly bears, despite their tracks being visible. The hoot of an owl was the only disturbance to our uneventful night. We were grateful to leave behind the unforgiving terrain of Death Valley, with its treacherous sands, haunting specters, bitter lakes, and desolate wasteland. It would be a relief if the waves of the sea could sweep over its barren emptiness. Our memories of it were only associated with decrepit relics of the past, a place so uninhabitable that we questioned if it was ever deemed very good by the Creator himself. Our journey from a land of abundance across stark hills and plains to this mild and attractive land was one of survival. We were no longer famished and parched, but surrounded by bountiful natural resources that energized us. The gold we sought took a back seat to our newfound appreciation for life. The land teemed with plenty as we relished the bounty of the land. We were no longer nearly dead but alive, invigorated by the world around us. The cattle, once thin and frail, had now found themselves in lush pastures, happily chewing on the sweet and savory blades of grass. Their former misery had wrought a similar burden on our own lives, but now we felt the weight lifting, replaced with joyous relief. We struggled to find the words to properly express our gratitude to the higher power that had granted us deliverance, but we knew that, whether formally stated or not, our thankfulness and appreciation radiated from our very cores. We didn't need to kneel before an altar in a grand cathedral to make our voices heard. Despite our newfound safety in the land of promise, we knew that our journey was far from over. We still had a great distance to travel before the rivers, where we hoped to find gold, could be reached. However, we felt comfort in the fact that we were no longer in immediate peril. We looked forward to meeting kind-hearted settlers who could offer us much-needed aid as we continued on our path. Thanks to a peaceful night's rest, Mrs. Bennet was feeling much better by the next morning. We prepared ourselves to move forward, following the trail of the jayhawkers. The vines and brambles that had once blocked our way had since been cleared, leaving us a mostly smooth path to take. However, as we approached the narrow valley, the hills seemed to close in on us from both sides, leaving us with no other choice but to wade through the stream. The ground was slippery and treacherous, and even the women with their soaking wet moccasins had a tough time keeping their footing. The cool shade of the creek was a welcome respite from the hot sun, but it wasn't long before exhaustion took hold, making it clear that we needed to stop and rest. We found a dry spot with enough vegetation to keep the oxen sated and made it our temporary home. The wood crackled and sparked as it caught fire, the flames leaping high and casting a warm glow upon the weary travelers gathered around it. The women, soaked to the bone from trudging through the water, stood before the fire, slowly turning to try and warm themselves. One of the men chuckled as they spun, remarking that they looked just like geese roasting on a spit. If it weren't for their exhaustion, the women may have given him the beating he deserved for such a comment. As they began to dry off and regain some level of comfort, the women spoke of their shared experience, and how even this deluge was better than the unforgiving desert they had recently faced. They joked about their appearance, knowing they were far away from society's gaze, and looked forward to the day when they could change into proper clothing. One of the women complained that she had been forced into the brook at least a dozen times, and that repeated cold water baths were surely not beneficial for the health. But all around them, spirits were high. Young Charlie Arcane was finally on the mend, no thanks to any medicine, but rather the fresh air and water of their journey. The day had been grueling, with Arcane struggling to keep the brush from pulling others into the water. But no one had lost their positive attitude. They had found a safe haven in a deep canyon, surrounded by thick brush that kept the wind at bay. Each person took turns cooking, and no one was declared the boss. They had no money, nor any opportunity to use it, but they had an abundance of tasty meat to cook as they pleased. In comparison to Death Valley, this was practically paradise, and everyone commented on how fortunate they were to be here. There were minor nuisances to bear, but they were nothing when weighed against the larger picture. Perhaps, as one person mused, a course of desert training could cure a fault-finder of their negativity. The following day our journey led us to a creek that was much wider and had no trees blocking our path. The sandy soil was covered in sagebrush, and the stream, which earlier had made us quite wet, was now invisible in the sandy bottom. The hills on the left were sparsely wooded, while the right side was brimming with brush. We spotted cattle tracks in the sand, and although we didn't see any other animals, the chirping of small birds and the familiar whistle of meadowlarks filled the air. A large hawk circled high above us, casting a watchful eye on all below. We stopped for a break at noon and noticed that the water in the creek had slightly increased. But by the time we were ready to move again, the water had vanished, having been absorbed by the thirsty sand. We deduced that the water came from somewhere near the place where we slaughtered the 3 cattle, and that we had left before the flood came down. The next day we crossed over a low ridge to head towards a picturesque valley. As the summit neared, a breathtaking sight unfolded before us. A mammoth green meadow of about 1,000 acres stretched before us, set against a backdrop of low mountains. The oak trees at the base of the mountains added to the splendor, and there was no brush to block the beautiful views. The land was like an English park from the pages of a novel. The cattle of all sorts and sizes grazed across the field, with old Jacob's ring-streaked and speckled breed taking the forefront. Some lazily nibbled at the grass, while others rested and chewed their cud. Meanwhile, agile calves raced around and then contentedly nursed from satisfied mothers. We paused to camp and released the animals from their loads, allowing them to enjoy the sweet grass to their heart's content. We lingered in that verdant oasis for what seemed like hours, basking in the beauty of the scene. The cattle grazed contentedly, and we couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between this paradise and the barren wasteland we had traversed to get here. It was as though we had stumbled into another world entirely. We were all so entranced by the sight that none of us wanted to leave. We spoke of how we could never go back to the desolate desert we had just escaped, and marveled at how wonderful it would be if everywhere were just as lush and green as this place. As we reveled in the abundance that surrounded us, we couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of strength and vitality. The oxen, too, seemed to have regained their strength and marched proudly alongside us as we continued down the winding valley, towards the house we had been told was our destination. It was March the 7th, 1850, a date that would be forever etched in our memories, much like November the 4th, 1849, the day we had taken the fateful cut-off that led us on this harrowing journey. Even now, at the age of 73, I can recall every moment of that trip, every campsite, and every hardship endured. The canyon we had just left had since been transformed into a bustling railway, with a tunnel piercing the steep ridge we had hiked. And the beautiful meadow that had so captivated us was now a thriving agricultural hub, covered in rows upon rows of plump apricots drying in the sun. But even though the cattle have long since disappeared and the landscape has changed, that moment of awe and wonder remains forever captured in my memory, like a snapshot of a bygone era, a reminder of a time when we were all just travelers passing through a magnificent land. We loaded up our belongings into our packs and set out into the gorgeous green valley. The women each carried a sturdy staff in hand, and the unknown terrain and surroundings were thrilling to us. Rogers and I knew that we would soon encounter unfamiliar faces, people who spoke an unknown tongue that we couldn't communicate with, and our lack of funds only compounded our troubles. We had no idea how we were going to obtain the necessary items we needed to survive, and this weighed heavily on our minds. The mines we were aiming for were still 500 miles away, and we had no intel on any employment opportunities closer by. Our lives had been returned to us, and now the challenge we faced was to maintain them independently and with courage. Our only fallback plan, in case all else failed, was to trek to San Francisco, attempting to hunt our food on the way. With any luck, we would ultimately reach the gold mines, but the path that lay ahead was blurry, and we could only hope that Providence would guide us through, the one thing that rarely deserted those who strive to aid themselves. Amid this uncertainty, we began to harbor some very independent thoughts. We had one trusty mule to carry our camp kettle and meat. Our cattle were steadily improving and could soon fatten up, which would enable them to carry our blankets and other strange odds and ends. Old Crump, who we nicknamed the Christian, could still transport the youngest children of the two families, and Bennett and I were experienced hunters and possessed excellent rifles. Thus we were still capable of progressing, and we vowed that we would emerge victorious no matter what the circumstances. These were some of the schemes tossed about as we rested in our camps and spoke as we journeyed. If we could somehow equip the two families with the necessary resources so that they could survive without us, Rogers and I could advance toward the mines at a swift pace, and no doubt advance ourselves in the process. Since we were younger than the others, we could withstand greater hardships. After reaching Los Angeles, we would reevaluate our plans and ascertain the most effective course of action. We made it to our campsite, nestled at the base of a little hill, the same one we'd been striving towards for so long. Dropping our goods beneath the welcoming shade of a willow tree, we were greeted by the good lady of the nearby house, her little one in tow. She paused, surveying our surroundings, taking in the sight of two small tots resting on makeshift blankets. I could hear her uttering mucha pobre to herself, pitying our overstretched means of survival, our ragged clothes and scrappy faces giving away our destitution. The lady then set her sights on our oxen and mule, murmuring, "Flaco, flaco," as she observed their thin frames. She then turned to my companion Rogers and me, recognizing our faces from a prior visit. Her young one, fearful of our curious figures, clung tightly to her dress. As she dug through her pocket to produce an orange, she pointed to the children in our party. Had we delivered the 4 oranges she'd dispatched along with us? With nods and gestures, we indicated that we had indeed done as asked. Her response, "Buenos muchachos," good boys, was met with relief. Words exchanged, with no shared language between us, it was Arcane who spoke up with conviction. "Me Catholic," he declared. Though it was clear the lady only partly understood, his declaration gained us some welcome points. Soon after, 2 men on horseback arrived on the scene, sizing us up with some interest. Arcane, a mason by trade, offered up the Masonic sign as a greeting, though it went unrecognized by either gentleman. We used the few Spanish words that I had scribbled down in my notebook and memorized, adding some gestures in hopes of communicating with these men. Our attempts seemed to have worked, as they understood something about our situation and the fact that Mr. French, who had previously helped us, had mentioned the possibility of obtaining meat or carne from them. These horsemen were a sight to behold, with their fine equestrian skills, long hide leggings that reached their hips, hats with broad brims, and great spurs affixed to their boots. The braided rawhide ropes coiled on the saddles of each rider added to their dashing appearance. They sped off with purpose, returning promptly with a well-fed, plump 2-year-old heifer. As they neared our camp, the rider at the back deftly cast his riata to capture both hind legs of the animal. The heifer was then thrown off balance when the other riders made a sudden move on their horses. One of them dismounted, and at a signal his horse backed up to keep the rope taut, while the man took out his knife and cut the animal's throat. Once the heifer had ceased struggling, they released the ropes and coiled them back on their saddles as they approached us, gesturing to the slaughtered animal in a way that meant, "It's yours for the taking." Chapter 18. Walker Pass. We couldn't believe the kindness of the locals. Without hesitation, we began preparing the animal we had caught. Cutting off some succulent pieces of fat, we roasted them over the fire and savored each morsel as if it were the most delicious meat we had ever tasted. The sweet and fragrant aroma wafted through the air, tantalizing our senses. If only a French chef could capture the essence of our meal, he would be deemed a master of his craft. After our feast, we selected a hindquarter and hung it from a tree. Upon the lady's return, we informed her that it was all we needed at the moment. She then instructed the others to take the remaining meat and the hide to the house. As night began to fall, the cowboys herded the cattle into the corral. The sturdy oak posts encircled a space of about half an acre, creating a secure stockade. The horsemen rode in and expertly roped the calves, displaying an impressive level of skill and expertise. It was clear that in the hands of a seasoned cowboy, a rawhide rope was a more powerful weapon than any firearm. As the spectacle ended, Rogers made his way back to the camp. Along the way, he bumped into Bennett, Arcane, and their families, who had some blankets with them. They had been invited to stay in the house overnight by the kind lady. They offered for us to keep camp while they were away, with their trusty dog Cuff watching over us. We gladly accepted and had a peaceful night's sleep, accompanied only by the occasional bark of the house dogs and the soft hoot of an inquisitive owl that perched on our tree. The next day the group returned to camp, eager to share their experiences. The hosts greeted them with flapjacks, followed by a spicy bean dish and succulent pieces of squash cooked to perfection over the open fire. The main course was a dish of dried meat mixed with green peppers and fried in beef tallow, known as chili con carne. Although a little too hot for some, it proved to be a favorite of the Californians and quickly became a favorite of the guests, too. The children were treated with special care and attention, and the evening came to a close with a half-hour silence during which a few set words were repeated by some. Afterwards, the guests arranged their blankets on the floor to sleep, but found it difficult to rest due to the unfamiliar surroundings and the children's restlessness. Despite this, they were grateful for the most gracious hospitality of their hosts. The next morning, 2 horsemen and 2 Indians gathered at the corral to catch a cow with their ropes. The cow's head was tied up to a post, while the hind legs were bound tightly above the gambrel joint, and the tail was fastened as well. A large bucket and several gourds completed the scene. The Native Americans tended to the cows they had captured and tied down, milking them for a pint to 2 quarts of milk each. They didn't have the same milking methods as we did at home, so the process was a bit slow. The calves had been separated the night before to save some milk for themselves. When they had their desired amount, they poured it into a bucket and presented it to us with small gourds for drinking. Being famished, we savored the food and drank as much as we could. It was a true feast for us. When we offered to pay them for their kindness, they refused and shook their heads. Their hospitality and sincerity meant a lot to us, and we never forgot it. To this day, the sight of a Californian native brings back memories of these lovely people, and we always remembered to respect and thank the Native American race. This generous and welcoming rancho was called San Francisquito, or Little San Francisco Rancho. The next morning, Mr. Arcane arranged for his family to be taken to the seashore by the Native Americans. He offered them his 2 oxen as payment, as he had no money or property to sell, except for a spyglass worth about $10. It was a poor prospect, but he had hoped that he could get passage to San Francisco in a sailing vessel. He bid farewell to his friends and put a light gold ring on my finger as a gift. He also gave his silver watch to Rogers, expressing his gratitude for us saving their lives. Tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke about how he could never repay us for what we had done for him. He hoped he would see us again soon, and we would always be welcome to visit him. I watched as Mr. Arcane helped his wife onto her horse, Charlie, before saying their goodbyes to us. Mrs. Arcane was overcome with emotion and could barely form the words to bid us farewell. I knew that their journey was far from over. They still had 60 miles to ride to reach the sea. And with Mrs. Arcane unaccustomed to the rigors of such a ride, I couldn't help but worry for her well-being. As they rode away, our little caravan felt much smaller. But we were all in good spirits, grateful for the large amount of food and water we had at our disposal, and pleased to see our animals growing stronger each day. We loaded our belongings onto the oxen and mule, hitched the children onto Old Crump, and once again prepared to set out on our journey. Our friends lingered for a while longer, curious about the route we had just traveled and inquiring about the Indians we had encountered. I gestured towards the ground, giving them a rough estimation of the distance we had traveled, and assured them that the Indians, or Indianos as they called them, had not been a problem for us. But I could see that one of the men was toying with an idea. He drew a map in the dirt and made it clear that he was contemplating a journey back to retrieve the wagons we had left behind, and he wanted me to come with him. I weighed his proposition thoughtfully, ultimately deciding that it was not worth the risk. But I was touched by his bravery and determination, and I wished him luck on his potential journey. With that, we all said our goodbyes again and began to move forward, waving to each other until we could no longer see any trace of our new friends. I told him the truth as I saw it, pointing to both his map and mine, and explained that it was simply impossible to bring them over. He looked deeply disappointed and with a heavy sigh muttered, "Mucho malo," a Spanish colloquial phrase meaning very bad. He seemed to have given up on the idea of acquiring a Yankee wagon. They were fascinated by the sight of one, given that their vehicles were nothing more than rough affairs that I would describe in due course. We bade our adieus, and I continued on my way, quickly catching up with my group. We had been on the road for a whole year, traveling between Wisconsin and California. Much of the time our bed was the ground beneath us. Our meals had been meager and far apart, but we seldom missed one on account of illness. A few of the weaker ones had fallen by the wayside, left behind with no coffin or grave. But we were still here, having kept ourselves nourished with the prospect of game in the future, if nothing better presented itself. We still talked of going to the gold mines on foot. With good food and rest our courage had returned, and we were determined to succeed. That night we set up camp at a lovely watering place with an abundance of dry oak wood for fires and plenty of grass for our horses. It was situated at the foot of the San Fernando Mountain, which, unlike the rocky terrain we had encountered earlier, was lush with greenery. It was a bit steep to climb, but in comparison to the rough, barren mountains we had traversed on our way from Death Valley, it was a mere baby. Our current state of mind was an odd one. We were happy, optimistic, and content amidst our surroundings, but there was still a nagging uncertainty about our future, the path ahead shrouded in obscurity. Despite it all, we continued to push forward, grateful for every moment we were given, trusting in the kindness of Providence to guide us on our journey. We sat, chatting after dinner and dreaming of the future. When we had a place of our own, we would welcome friends and strangers alike, just as we had been welcomed by others during our travels. Our minds were alive with possibilities. Our meal was delicious, a feast provided by our generous hosts. As we sat in peaceful silence, we were visited by a flock of the most stunning birds. They were so beautiful that we dared not move, afraid to scare them away. We watched in awe as they passed us by. Among them were a few larger birds and a group of smaller ones. Their symmetrically shaped bodies and small tufts on their heads made them stand out. The California quail was truly a sight to behold. When morning came, we set out to climb a nearby hill. Thankfully, our rawhide moccasins were now dry and molded to our feet. We took our time, making steady progress. As we climbed, we were rewarded with a breathtaking view of the vast grassy plain below us. In the distance, we could see the buildings and lush gardens of the San Fernando Mission. It was in stark contrast to the desolate Death Valley we had encountered on our travels. It was as if two completely different worlds existed side by side. We took a rest, catching our breath from the winding path down the hill that brought us to the level land. After a few miles, we came upon the mission houses and the Church of San Fernando. However, the place appeared barren, with only a single man and a few Indians in sight. The man kindly offered oranges to the children as we rested. Soon we embarked again on a road that was smoothly descending. Nightfall came, and we had not reached any source of water. Yet we camped here and experienced no discomfort. The next day we passed a stream, and nearby we saw an empty house. The road began to bring us through hills filled with big grass and clover, suggesting the soil was rich. We chatted excitedly about it with each other. From the peak of those hills we had a breathtaking view extending south and west. Small creatures, most likely horses and cattle, dotted the land and were happily grazing. Our own animals had ample chances to eat, and we were thrilled at the sight. Though it was not as spellbinding as our first glance of the place, the view still satisfied us. In the east stood a snow-capped peak, and around us were green fields of grass and wildflowers warmed by a mild early spring. The contrast was striking. Hot Death Valley, with its barrenness, may have had a greater temperature contrast with the snowy mountain, yet the snow felt more pleasing. Here, in this place, the vegetation and air sweetly coexisted, and compared to nature's snowy guest, felt more commonplace. It was unlike our chilly, gusty March in Wisconsin, and we pondered if it remained summer here all year. We concluded we could make a home here, should we be unable to proceed further. The vastness of the prairie belonged to the United States, and owning even a tiny portion would be achievable. We could raise our cattle and crops. If the locals were as hospitable as the gentlemen we met earlier, then we would surely experience a neighborly essence. I want to convey the impressions that we received at the time without adding the filter of hindsight. The sights we saw were stranger than fiction. As we crested the hills, a village came into view near the southern base. It was a new and strange sight for us, and we approached it with curiosity. The houses were squat and only 1 story tall, constructed from a gray mud material. The flat roofs and empty streets added to the isolated feel of the place. Occasionally a man could be seen strolling about, or a dog lazily lounging in the sun. An Indian sat with his back against a house, immersed in thought. The village seemed sparsely populated, and the complete lack of wagons or animals was a rather odd occurrence. We couldn't help but wonder if there was anyone left in this mud city to greet us. Despite our apprehension, we paused to rest just outside of the village for half an hour or so. Then we mustered our courage and made our way down the hill into the street. Almost immediately we came across an American man who was happy to point us in the direction of a suitable camping area. As we walked through the village, the curious children emerged from the houses to see our strange little group. Old Crump carried the children, and we followed behind, looking dirty and ragged. Mrs. Bennet's dress was much shorter than the accepted length in either Spanish-American or good United States society, and her rawhide moccasins were only made more noticeable because of it. We probably looked quite a sight in our mismatched and tattered clothes. We continued down the hill to the lower bottom, while the barefoot and bareheaded village urchins followed along to get a better look at us. As we searched for a suitable camping spot, we eventually came across 2 tents and some wagons that looked like they belonged to overland travelers. Intrigued, we made our way over to them. As we approached, the 2 men stood up and gazed at us with perplexity. But as we came closer, they recognized Bennett and hurried towards us. "My God, it's Bennett!" they exclaimed, and without saying a word they hugged him tightly while one of them warmly greeted Mrs. Bennett. The unexpected reunion was so emotional that they shed tears before guiding us back to their camp. The camp belonged to R.G. Moody and H.C. Skinner, along with their families. They had met on their journey on the Platte River and had become the closest of companions. However, they had been waiting at camp for over 6 weeks, hoping for some reliable news about Bennett's whereabouts. Seeing him and his family safe and sound was a great relief. As the group caught up on lost time, Rogers and I took care of Old Crump, the oxen, and the mule. We unpacked the animals and set up our own campsite under a massive willow tree. Since Rogers and I were not part of Bennett's group, we busied ourselves with our tasks. In the meantime, Bennett and his wife were welcomed into Mr. Moody's tent, where they refreshed and cleaned up. Mrs. Bennett was especially grateful for the soap, which allowed her to wash her face and hair and change into a new, clean dress. Even Bennett seemed spruced up and rejuvenated. The children, too, were outfitted in new clothes and took to their new appearance with obvious delight. It was a reunion that was a long time in the making, and a memorable one at that. Supper was a welcome sight, and the aroma of real bread made our mouths water. With smiles spread across our faces, we eagerly accepted the offer. Mrs. Bennett carefully broke pieces for the children, reminding them not to overindulge. It was a joy to be amongst friends who truly understood us. Once supper was finished and the table was cleared, we formed a circle and settled in. Bennett shared the story of his many days on the newly shortened trail. Mr. Moody expressed his skepticism, having nearly given up on the party entirely and planning to go up the coast the following day. The story was so captivating that we talked until our eyelids grew heavy, only to pick up again after breakfast. We shared every detail of our incredible journey and all the struggles we encountered. Sadly, Mr. R.G. Moody, his wife and daughter, as well as Mrs. Quinby and son Charles, have all since passed. H.C. Skinner, Moody's brother-in-law, lived in San Jose for many years, but has also passed, along with his son and daughter. Rogers and I retrieved the pack saddle we had borrowed from Mr. French for our upcoming trip to Death Valley. We brought it to the saloon on the east side of the plaza, promising to return it if we made it back safely. We were grateful for Mr. French's kindness and generosity, and we assured him that we would always be willing to return the favor if the opportunity presented itself to others in the area, which undoubtedly helped us along the way. At the saloon, the atmosphere was thick with the thrill of possibility. The large room was filled with tables where gambling was happening at a rapid pace. Money exchanged hands with lightning speed, and drinks were flowing so freely that it seemed like a never-ending river of booze. The whole scene moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, like any other business transaction. The door stood wide open, beckoning any and all to enter at their leisure. We couldn't help but notice the fair-looking black-eyed women who circulated among the crowd. This was a sight we had never seen before, as women in saloons were a rarity. We watched the game unfold, tensions running high as people won and lost in equal measure. But as poor wanderers with no money to speak of, we couldn't have joined even if we wanted to. So we lingered on the periphery, watching from afar before eventually taking a seat outside. It was under the vast expanse of the sky that we discussed our chances of getting to the mines, our clothing barely fit for purpose. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs and feet that were pitifully, woefully inadequate. We had the little black-eyed mule and the watch given to Rogers by Arcane, but that was it. Mr. Moody had informed us that it was a grueling 500 miles to San Francisco, and then another 150 miles further to the mines. After a year of relentless hard travel, we were still a long way from our intended destination. We cast our eyes around the valley, unable to spot any viable means of making a living. The land was not cultivated, no fences in sight, and nothing to indicate any kind of labor-intensive work was being undertaken. The valley was fertile, and the grasses growing were flourishing, but the only animals we saw were the cattle and horses grazing idly. It looked as if people here primarily subsisted on meat. I knew that if we could pull together a bit of food, like flour and beans, I could pack it on the mule, and I was confident we'd be able to hunt some game that would provide a welcome change from the meager rations we had survived on over the past 2 months on the harsh desert terrain. We walked around the city of mud, hoping to find a way to earn some money. Unfortunately, our search was in vain. As we roamed, we couldn't help but notice some peculiar things. There were more women and children than men, and the streets were filled with dogs. Near the river there were grapevines that were fenced in with living willows, and in some places dry vines twisted in between. The locals were content with their simple lives. The Indians moved about at a moderate pace, and it was clear they had plenty of beef to sustain them with few other needs to worry about. We saw a few people purchasing small things at the stores with their small change. The women all dressed in the same style, donning dresses made from cheap materials, sandals on their feet, and a long shawl draped over their heads and shoulders. There were no hoops or corsets in their fashion. The men wore trousers made from white cotton or linen, paired with a calico shirt, sandals, and a broad-rimmed, snuff-colored hat. The Indians and their wives didn't wear any form of headgear. As we neared the end of the street, we stumbled upon a boarding house and decided to enter. The room was empty, and we sat down to rest. Shortly after, a man walked in, dressed better than us, and to our surprise, he was one of the old Death Valley travelers, Reverend J.W. Breyer, the same man whom I had seen camping alone in the desert while preaching to his sons about the power of education. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of irony with death looming in the background and him preaching. We sat down and talked about the difficult journey we had both encountered as his group had pushed forward and made it through ahead of us. He recounted how he and Mr. Granger had set up a boarding house upon their arrival, and business had been booming thanks to the influx of emigrants. He assured us that as long as people continued to migrate through, he would be able to sustain himself. We inquired about opportunities to make enough money to buy provisions to aid us on our way to the mines. He offered to hire one of us to draw water for the boarding house with an ox and cart, noting that the person who could handle the oxen should be the one for the job. As someone who had experience in ox driving, I jumped at the opportunity and accepted the offer when he mentioned it paid $50 a month. It was an excellent chance for me to regain my strength and weight. I let my mule loose near the hills and began my work. It wasn't too taxing as the number of boarders dwindled. The locals didn't frequent the establishment much either. Still, the food disappeared quickly from my corner of the table, and though it lacked variety and preferred delicacies, I found myself particularly satisfied. Rogers returned to the old camp and helped out while I often went over after dark, having finished my tasks for the day. Moody and Skinner had been persuading Mr. Bennett to join them on a journey up the coast. Bennett sold his repeating rifle to contribute to the necessary funds, and, with the help of his friends, procured another ox, bringing the total number of yokes to 2. They also constructed a wagon for him, and additional yokes were acquired, traded off by those who had opted for horses instead. With the provisions Moody and Skinner had gathered, Rogers joined the party to lend a hand to the team. Chapter 19. Finally to the mines. I found myself all alone once they had left, but I had a plan. I promised myself that if my trusty mule remained healthy, I'd leave after a month, even if I had to go solo. The majority of the men in town had already left for the mines, leaving behind a disproportionately high number of women. We knew that the men would return in November, and that's when the town's gambling would kick into full gear. These Californians had a natural inclination for games of chance, particularly Monte, and they'd bet their last coin in hopes of winning big. As the boarding house business slowed down, I was transferred to a vineyard where I was tasked with weeding instead of hauling water. The entire patch was thick with weeds, but clearing them out was good for me. I could feel myself getting healthier and stronger every day, becoming more and more myself with each passing moment. Soon I'd be strong enough to make the journey to the mines. Then, after 2 weeks of weeding, 2 older gentlemen arrived in town. They claimed to be from Sacramento and were looking to buy horses for the market there. However, they'd only been able to purchase a mere 6 or 8 so far, as the price was too high to make driving all the way to Sacramento for the market worth it. They were considering giving up and trying their hand at some other enterprise. This seemed like the perfect opportunity for me. I'd have company on the road, and I wouldn't be alone for the long journey ahead. So I went to Breyer and Granger and asked if they'd allow me to leave and join these men on their mission. They agreed, paying me $25 for my half a month's work. With that money, I felt like I could finally make it to the mines. With a couple of days to prepare, I started gathering the necessities. I scoured the area and discovered an abandoned saddle tree which I managed to repair for my own use. Along the way, I stumbled upon a discarded firearm left behind by a passer-by. With some effort, I was able to merge the breech of that firearm with my own, which had been temporarily tied together with rawhide. Although it wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing, I now had a dependable working firearm. After procuring a sturdy Spanish blanket from a nearby store, which happened to contain a convenient hole in its middle, I could wear it as a cloak during inclement weather or at night. It wasn't quite as expansive as our blankets, but it was resilient enough to withstand the test of time. With the addition of some carne seca, or dried beef, and a handful of crackers, along with a stash of salt for seasoning, my trip was provisioned. I sought out my mule near the hills, where I had left her earlier. After receiving a good rest and some fulfilling nourishment, she seemed to be in better spirits, and I felt the same. Meanwhile, the drovers had picked up 2 more men to aid them in their journey. With my blanket beneath the saddle and my provisions fastened behind me, I climbed into the saddle with my firearm firmly in hand. I felt entirely confident and fully prepared to tackle any obstacle that lay ahead of us. I silently declared that the only impediment keeping me from reaching the gold mines would involve taking my life. Nothing seemed insurmountable, be it a towering mountain or desolate desert wasteland. I had already experienced suffering, starvation, and hardship, and I was ready to do it all over again if it meant that I could acquire some of that glittering gold dust. I must admit I was quite ignorant when it came to the elusive substance known as gold. The miners spoke of it as gold dust, leading me to believe it was as fine as flour, but I had no clue how to catch it. Still, I was determined to learn. It had become an obsession of sorts, a desire to witness the yellow dust in its natural state before it was transformed into coins at the mint. During my last meal at the house, I found myself among a few select individuals, including a dapper gentleman from California. He didn't seem too keen on American cuisine, but he managed to get by until it was time for dessert. Mrs. Breyer brought around a rather unfortunate-looking duff, which the Californian tried a few times before setting his spoon down in disgust, deeming it no bueno, and muttering a few other words that I couldn't quite decipher at the time. It seems those words meant too much grease, a concept that was foreign to him. As for my accommodations, I had fashioned my bed out of old rags and blankets in a small storeroom. While rummaging around for materials, I happened upon a bag of coarse sugar crystals, some as large as corn. It was certainly a treasure, alongside a few other luxuries I was entrusted to guard. However, I couldn't resist the temptation of the sweet crystals and pocketed a handful or so for myself. With a bittersweet farewell to Mrs. Briar and his company, I mounted my horse, my mind consumed by thoughts of gold. The end. This concludes Survival Stories, Death Valley Pioneers, written by Doug Richardson, narrated by Bo Carson. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.